Welcome to Leading Your Culture with Bill Nye. This episode is brought to you by Multifamily Media Network, delivering the latest news, ideas, and inspiration across the multifamily sector. Now let's go ahead and jump into the next episode of Leading Your Culture with Bill Nye. If you're an NFL fan, then you probably watched the AFC and the NFC championship games that were played recently between the Philadelphia Eagles, the Washington Commanders, and the Buffalo Bills and the Kansas City Chiefs. In watching both of those games, something really stood out to me that I wanted to talk about today in my podcast. Prior to the first game, which was the Eagles-Commanders game, they did an interview, Fox did an interview with Buffalo Bills wide receiver Mac Hollis. And Mac Hollis made a statement that just really stood out. He said that coming to Buffalo, he learned something very valuable. He said he learned that it's not about the talent of the players, but rather the culture of the team that makes the difference. Then at the conclusion of the Buffalo-Kansas City game, they had, of course, the stage, and they were handing out the Lamar Hunt Trophy, which went to the Hunt family, owners of the Kansas City Chiefs. And Dallas Hunt, the current owner of the Chiefs, was asked about their success over the last several years. This will be their third straight Super Bowl. This was their seventh consecutive year of going to a conference championship game, one shy of the New England Patriots record of 8 consecutive years. And so he was asked about that and asked to talk a little bit about what he attributes this success. And Dallas Hunt said it's the culture that Andy Reid has brought to the team. And so here you have pregame show prior to the first game and postgame after the second game. You have two individuals talking about culture. And you hear this in sports a lot. You hear sports figures constantly talking about culture. But you know who never talks about the culture of the team? That's a team that loses. That's a team that has a bad record, a bad season, or loses a game. They never say, well, we lost, and really it comes down to our culture. But the truth is, it does come down to their culture. Even teams that have just a terrible season, in baseball, they lose 100 games. In the NFL, they lose, 10 or more games. They have a culture. Every organization has a culture. The minute two people come together, then a culture begins to grow. And so, the team that wins has a culture and the team that loses has a culture. But what they grow in their culture is what really makes a difference. Now, years ago, I was having a conversation with someone who owns a multifamily portfolio, and he said, we have a culture of winning. There's no such thing as a culture of winning. Winning is a byproduct of the culture. You win because of your culture. You don't have a winning culture. If you had a winning culture, then that would make things easy. Just build a winning culture and then you always win. But nobody always wins, right? Even though, the Patriots, as I mentioned earlier, went to 8 straight conference championship games. Look at where the Patriots are today. Look at their record, their lack of success. They're not currently winning, and they haven't for a few years. And so if it were a matter of just simply growing a winning culture, then everybody would grow a winning culture and everybody would win. But it isn't that simple. There's a lot more to it. And so the culture is what drives the winning, or the culture is what actually prohibits the winning. And so to hear these two guys talk about this, and, it got me thinking, what Mac Hollis said about, it's not about the talent of the players, but rather the culture of the team. And I thought, that's really smart, because what he's really saying is that we put something together that's special, and a big part of that is accountability. Now, accountability is always something that grows in a healthy culture, and it's often something that's missing or lacking in an unhealthy culture. In a culture that, rather than growing things that are productive and successful and profitable, they're growing. You've heard me say this. If you watch my podcast or if you read my book, you hear me refer to these things as the weeds. Because if you're not constantly tending to your culture, weeds are always trying to grow. And those weeds are the things that prevent profitability, success, winning, if you will. employee, engagement, customer satisfaction. Weeds will choke those things out. And so things that will come up like, individual stats, individual credit, individual, gain, selfishness, those become the things that grow in an unhealthy culture. And you could imagine on a sports team, when you have players who are only playing for themselves or playing for the next contract, they're looking out for themselves, then that's a team that's going to struggle to be successful and win on a consistent basis. But when you have that accountability in place, where two things happen when it comes to accountability. And by the way, I want to be really clear. I think there's a lot of misconceptions about what accountability is. Accountability isn't punishment. Accountability isn't, terminating people. I've said many times as I'm speaking around the country that termination is not a form of accountability. Termination is what you do when accountability has failed. And so when accountability is in place, people don't have to be terminated because that accountability is taking care of the bad behavior, the bad performance. So, accountability is not a form of punishment. It's not a form of discipline, but rather it's a gift. Accountability is a very positive thing. But I learned, when I was serving in the Air Force, they constantly talked about imposed accountability and self-imposed accountability, meaning we can hold you accountable, but you should hold yourselves accountable so that we don't have to. And I think that's a really important lesson about holding yourself accountable. So, how do people become accountable to themselves and to one another? And by the way, that accountability, holding one another accountable, that's what I call group responsibility. It's understanding that what I do doesn't just affect me, but it affects everyone else in the group. Think about an airline pilot for a moment. When an airline pilot finishes his walk around or her walk around, and they strap themselves into the pilot seat in the cockpit of the plane, and they get clearance and they taxi out, that pilot has taken on the responsibility of the entire group on that plane. Now, I don't know that pilot. I don't know the pilot by name. It's not my neighbor. It's not a relative. In many cases, I'll never have a conversation with that pilot. But without even knowing who I am, without even knowing my name, that pilot has assumed responsibility for me, for my safety, and for the person sitting next to me, and for the person in front of me and behind me, for all of the flight attendants, for the co-pilot. They've taken on that responsibility to ensure that we take off, fly, and land safely. And that's an easy example of group responsibility. So, that accountability is really nothing more than group responsibility. So how do we become that person that holds ourselves accountable? And then also there's that group responsibility or that group accountability. And I think it comes down to discipline. And by discipline, I mean self-discipline, to where you're disciplined enough to do what you're supposed to do, when you're supposed to do it, in the way in which it's supposed to be done. And if you do that, then you're far less likely to make a mistake. But mistakes are still made. Now, this is where we struggle today in society. When mistakes are made, and I had Kevin Brewer on my podcast recently, and I hope you watched that episode. Kevin is a life coach, and we talked about this very briefly. We didn't dive into it very deeply. But, I asked Kevin the question as a life coach, why are people constantly looking for blame? Because that's the enemy of accountability is blame. It's the exact opposite. And, Kevin made a good point. He said, because blame shifts responsibility. If I can blame someone else, then I don't have to take any accountability for what happened. But, one of the things that's always been true and always will be true in leadership is that, and you'll see this from time to time in a meme or someone will post this on LinkedIn or some other form of social media, where they say leadership is accepting more than your share of the blame and less than your share of the credit. And I get what they're saying. There's a lot of truth to that, but one of the things I've always said is that if we focus on solving the problem instead of assigning the blame, many times in solving the problem, we discover that the blame really isn't that important. And so, having that discipline to do what you're supposed to do, when you're supposed to do it, and the way in which you're supposed to do it, that's the greatest form of personal accountability. If I do what I'm supposed to be doing, when I'm supposed to be doing it, in the way in which, and I'm disciplined enough to do that, then I'm taking accountability for the outcome. I'm taking accountability for the results. One of the things another thing I talk about frequently is I, am presenting to an audience around the country, is I say, learn to elevate instead of escalate. And, I understand that most of the time the audience, when I say that, they're like, well, what's the difference? And here's the difference. When you elevate, you're looking, or your goal is to solve something. When you're escalating, your goal is to prove something. And so in a healthy culture, in a really good, strong culture, people are constantly trying to find ways to solve something, not trying to prove something. But in an unhealthy culture, a culture that isn't as productive or as profitable, or, adapt to winning, somebody's constantly looking to prove something. Well, what are they trying to prove? Well, they're trying to prove I'm the boss, I'm in charge, I've been here the longest, I have tenure, I'm the smartest. The last time we made a decision, I was right and you were wrong. Just constantly having to prove that. And those are the weeds that I constantly talk about. That's a weed that is choking out the good things that could actually grow in your culture. And so, what I hope you'll gain from this is, as leaders, as you're trying to build as you're trying to grow a really strong, healthy culture, understand that there's no guarantee that you're going to win. No one wins forever. Some organizations win more than others, and they have a more consistent outcome, a more consistent performance. And it isn't by accident. It's because they are focusing daily on their culture. And a part of that is that form of accountability, hold myself accountable, doing what I'm supposed to be doing, when I'm supposed to be doing it, and the way in which I'm supposed to do it. And if I see somebody not doing it when they should, or in the way in which they should, then I owe it to everybody in the organization, including the customers, to have a conversation and point that out and to deal with that, to help them to become, a better player in their role, if you will, on the team. And so, I hope that, for the leaders out there, and you're watching this and you're thinking about this, remember, I say this all the time, and you'll probably hear me say it again and again and again. Accountability shouldn't make people feel bad about their present, but rather optimistic about their future. See, if I have a conversation with somebody who's done something wrong, and all I do is scold them, belittle them, berate them, point out their failures, point out their mistakes, all I've done is make them feel bad about who they are. I haven't actually taught them anything. But if instead I have a conversation that is about, showing them how to do it right, again, solving versus proving, solve the problem as opposed to having something to prove. And if I do it that way, then that person has learned how to do it better the next time. That's the optimism for the future. So remember, accountability shouldn't make people feel bad about their present, but rather optimistic about their future. And great leaders understand this, and great leaders have mastered this. And guess what I've learned? That if that's your approach, and that's what you're growing in your culture, really good people want to be a part of that, because they know when it's missing. When a team goes out on the field or onto the court or onto the ice and they lose, they know they've lost. If they're not very good, they know they're not very good. Wasn't that long ago, the Detroit Lions, who are now one of the better teams in the NFL, it wasn't that long ago they went 0-16 in the course of a season. Everybody on that team knew they were bad. And so when they brought in Dan Campbell and he changed the culture, he started growing things like accountability, doing the right thing in the right way at the right time, holding yourself and holding others accountable, and not doing it to make people feel bad about their present, but rather optimistic about their future. Okay, I had a bad game. I got beat off the ball by the guy lining up across from me on a regular basis. I have to do better than that. And so you work with the coaches to get better. Now you're optimistic that, hey, next Sunday I'm going to do better. And so, this is all part of the process of growing that culture that leads to winning. But remember, there's no such thing as a winning culture. Winning is a result of the culture, as losing is also a result of the culture. And so when you've got a great culture, you're more likely to win. When you've got a culture full of weeds, you're more likely to lose. And, a big part of this is that group responsibility, that personal accountability, and then that group accountability where we hold ourselves accountable. And so I hope this has caused you to think about your organization and your leadership and understanding, what these players and what Dallas Hunt understands, which is, as long as we have this culture, we're going to continue to win. And if our culture ever changes, like you've seen, for instance, with the New England Patriots, the winning days come to an end. Winning is a byproduct of the culture. Thanks for tuning in. As always, I hope you enjoyed this episode, and we'll talk to you again soon. Bye. Thanks for tuning in to Leading Your Culture with Bill Nye. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe, like, leave a review, and share it with your network. And remember, this podcast is proudly brought to you by Multifamily Media Network, your trusted source for stories, trends, and insights in multifamily living. I appreciate you checking out my episode. I'm Bill Nye, and this was Leading Your Culture with Bill Nye.